On April 11th, 1978, John Brisker called his girlfriend in Seattle after reportedly leaving the country for Africa. Their daughter was only 2 months old. The call ended, and nobody close to him ever heard his voice again. Where he was when he made it remains uncertain. There was no confirmed final destination, no verified sighting, and no physical evidence explaining what happened after the line went quiet. Brisker was not an anonymous traveler. He had been a 2-time ABA All-Star, a scorer who averaged more than 26 points in his prime, and one of the most feared competitors in professional basketball. He had also been charming and generous enough that team officials remembered how readily he appeared at charity events. The public legend and the private recollections never fit into one simple man. The disappearance was just as contradictory. Court records described an import-export venture. His brother later named a different country from the one most commonly associated with the trip. Former teammates repeated theories involving mercenary work, political violence, and the Ugandan government. The State Department could not even confirm that Brisker had reached Africa, and later said it did not consider the question resolved. 7 years after the final call, King County declared him deceased in absentia so his estate could be settled. That legal decision created a date on paper, not an answer. No remains had been recovered, and none of the competing stories had become proof. To understand why so many dark theories attached themselves to John Brisker, the story has to return to Detroit, to a gifted boy from the housing projects, a professional scorer with a frightening reputation, and a personality that could draw people close one moment and drive them away the next. John Brisker was born in 1947 and grew up in the housing projects of Detroit. The surviving record gives us the setting, but not permission to invent a complete psychology from it. What can be traced is the toughness people later saw in him, an intense need to command respect, a refusal to back down, and a competitive edge that could make him formidable or impossible, depending on the moment. But before any of that, there was the talent. Pure, undeniable talent. He attended Hamtramck High School in Hamtramck, Michigan, and on that court, he was a different breed. In 1965, he earned first-team All-State honors in basketball, the first hard, documented evidence that this kid from the projects was something special. All-State wasn't a participation ribbon. That was the state of Michigan officially recognizing him as one of the best high school players in the entire state. The high school recognition proves the gift. It does not prove that every later conflict was already waiting inside him. Those details emerged more clearly in college and the professional leagues, where coaches and teammates could marvel at his scoring one night and brace for his temper the next. What followed was not a simple story in which hardship automatically created violence. It was the story of a gifted athlete whose intensity kept outrunning the boundaries around him. On a basketball court, that tension would become his calling card. That all-state talent didn't go unnoticed. It earned him a path out, a college scholarship, a chance to turn that raw fire into a future. But his time at the next level would end in a way almost nobody saw coming. 6 games, and then a sudden walk-off that told you everything about the man he was becoming. John Brisker took his game to college and suited up for the Toledo Rockets. And once again, the talent spoke for itself. Nobody questioned whether he could play. The question with Brisker was never the gift. It was everything around the gift. In 1968, during what was supposed to be his senior season, the year designed to launch him into the professional ranks, something pulled him off course. He left the team. Not after a full season, not after building a senior year resume scouts could pore over. He walked away just 6 games into the year. 6 games, and then he was gone. Sit with how strange that is. This was the era when your final college season was your audition for everything that came next. Players didn't casually abandon that. They clawed for every minute, every stat line, every chance to be seen. But John Brisker walked off, and the records simply note that his college career ended right there, mid-stride, far short of the finish. Why? The clean answer is that the available sources do not fully explain it. What the record shows is unusual enough. John Brisker walked away before the season meant to launch his professional career had properly begun. Years before the world would lose track of John Brisker completely, basketball had already seen him do something unusual: leave before the story was supposed to end. Walking away from a team was a choice. His later disappearance remains unexplained. They are not the same event. The earlier departure matters because it showed how willing he was to reject the path other people expected him to follow. Most players who quit college that way disappear from the professional radar entirely. The scouts move on. The phones stop ringing. But in 1969, 2 professional leagues would look at this unfinished, walked-away talent and make 2 very different decisions about John Brisker. Here's where the John Brisker story takes its first hard turn into the improbable. In the 1969 NBA draft, the Philadelphia 76ers selected him as a supplemental pick. Now, think about what that actually means. This was a man who had played all of 6 games in his intended senior year before walking off. Most prospects with that kind of incomplete file get forgotten. But Philadelphia looked at the raw material, the size, the scoring, the sheer ability, and decided it was worth a bet anyway. That tells you just how loud the talent screamed, even through all the noise. But the basketball world wasn't unanimous on John Brisker. Not even close. In that same year's American Basketball Association draft, the rival upstart league that was busy raiding talent and rewriting the rules, Brisker went undrafted. Completely. Not a single ABA team called his name. So you had this remarkable split screen. One league spending a pick on him on pure potential, the other passing on him entirely. And then Brisker did the thing that, in hindsight, fits him perfectly. He turned down the established, respectable path. He didn't chase the NBA and the 76ers. Instead, he signed with the team from the league that hadn't even drafted him, the ABA's Pittsburgh Pipers. He bet on himself in the Wilder League on his own terms, the same way he'd left Toledo on his own terms. It was a defining choice. The ABA was scrappy, freewheeling, a little dangerous, a league still fighting for its life and its credibility. In other words, it was the perfect stage for a man like John Brisker, a place big enough for his game and loose enough for his temperament. In Pittsburgh, the basketball world was about to discover what Toledo already knew. The scoring was real. The fire was real, and the legend of the most feared man in the ABA was about to be born. When John Brisker arrived in Pittsburgh for the 1969 to 1970 season, the gamble paid off almost immediately. The man could flat out score. That first year, he earned ABA All-Rookie First Team honors, official recognition that the kid Philadelphia bet on and the ABA passed over was in fact one of the best newcomers the league had. Right out of the gate, The doubters looked foolish. But the rookie season was just the warm-up. As the franchise transitioned and Brisker settled into his role, his scoring detonated. In the 1970 to 1971 season, he poured in 29.3 points per game. The following year, 1971 to 1972, he put up 28.9 a night. Those aren't good numbers. Those are franchise-carrying, fill-the-arena, top-of-the-league numbers. For 2 straight seasons, John Brisker was one of the most explosive offensive players in all of professional basketball. The honors followed the production, exactly as they should have. He was named to back-to-back ABA All-Star teams in 1971 and 1972. He earned All-ABA second-team recognition in 1971. And when you step back and look at his entire professional run, the statistical spine is undeniable. He averaged 26.1 points per game across his ABA career. That's a star, not a role player who got hot for a stretch. A genuine, certified, 2-time All-Star scorer in his prime. To see the player behind those averages, start with the body. Brisker was listed at 6'5" and about 210 pounds, strong enough to play through contact, but skilled enough to score away from the rim. Contemporary accounts remembered that he could shoot, rebound, and carry an offense, and defenders had to guard all of it, while knowing the game might become personal. He could establish position with his shoulder, rise over a smaller wing, or attack space before a larger forward could turn. His scoring was not frightening merely because of the temper attached to it. The basketball problem came first. A powerful wing who could create points repeatedly and make the defender absorb him possession after possession. For a man whose college career ended with a sudden 6-game walk-off, this was vindication on the largest stage available to him. He had taken the harder road, the unlikelier road, and turned it into stardom. In Pittsburgh, John Brisker wasn't a question mark anymore. He was the answer, the bucket, the name on the marquee. But here's the truth about John Brisker that the scoring averages can never quite capture. The points told only half the story. The other half involved fists, ejections, and a team media guide that quite literally armed him with a pair of 6-shooters. The men sharing the court also knew that a possession could turn into a confrontation. Brisker fought often enough to be called the heavyweight champion of the ABA, a nickname that competed with his scoring achievements and eventually became easier to repeat than the details of his game. The Pittsburgh Condors did not soften the image. They sold it. Their media guide portrayed John Brisker wearing a pair of 6-shooters, like a gunfighter in an old western. A professional franchise took a volatile reputation and converted it into promotion, encouraging fans to see threat and entertainment as part of the same package. It was not only promotional noise. Teammates described genuine fear. Charlie Williams, who shared the locker room with him, remembered Brisker as an excellent player who could make the people around him measure every word. Williams said that if someone said the wrong thing, or Brisker believed he had, there was a feeling he might reach into his bag for a weapon. That was not an opponent exaggerating before a game. It was a teammate describing the atmosphere around him. The point is not that Williams documented an act in that moment. It is that fear had become part of Brisker's daily reputation. That reputation changed how every later incident was understood. It also threatened to bury the simpler fact that the man making teammates nervous was averaging close to 30 points a night. Some episodes went beyond recollection. In 1971, one confrontation spilled so far outside normal play, that police officers entered the story. Against the Denver Rockets, Brisker was ejected only 2 minutes into the game. He returned to the court 3 times while trying to reach the opponent involved in the conflict. Coaches, teammates, and officials could not end it. Police officers finally threatened arrest before Brisker went to the locker room. The sequence required no extra mythology. A professional game had stopped being able to contain one of its players. The most famous practice story is preserved as an account rather than a court finding. Coach Jack McMahon reportedly removed Brisker after he fought with teammates. Roughly half an hour later, Brisker was said to have returned carrying and waving a weapon. Whether retold in a locker room or printed years later, that image explains why people around him chose their words carefully. The intimidation also shaped how opponents approached him. In the basketball memoir Loose Balls, Coach Tom Nisolke recalled offering $500 to any Dallas Chaparrals player who knocked Brisker down. Lenny Chappell volunteered to start and flattened him on the opening jump without drawing a foul. The story says as much about the league as it does about Brisker. Officials, coaches, and players had begun treating physical escalation as strategy. By then, Brisker was not merely difficult to defend. He had become a problem some opponents tried to solve before basketball could begin. This was the package Seattle evaluated in 1972, an all-star scorer with a game worth major money, and a record of confrontations no front office could dismiss. The question was whether a larger league and a stronger organization could separate the production from the chaos. And a reputation like that, explosive, magnetic, impossible to ignore, doesn't slip past the men who run professional basketball. In 1972, one franchise decided that the danger was worth the gamble, and they were willing to pay an enormous sum to bring all of it to Seattle. By 1972, John Brisker had become one of the most talked about players in professional basketball, and not only for the right reasons, but the talent was real, the scoring was undeniable, and the National Basketball Association was watching. The Seattle SuperSonics decided to make their move and pull this ABA scoring machine into the bigger, more established league. And they didn't do it quietly. Reports at the time put the deal at a 6-year contract worth a reported $1 million. Now, you have to understand what that meant in that era. This wasn't today's basketball economy. A $1 million contract in the early 1970s was an enormous commitment. The kind of money that told the world a franchise believed it was buying a cornerstone. Seattle was betting big, and they were betting on a man whose file came with as many warnings as it did highlights. Rookie guard Slick Watts later remembered the status Brisker carried when they met. Brisker arrived in a long black Mercedes and belonged, in Watts's language, among Seattle's big dogs, alongside stars such as Spencer Haywood and Jim McDaniels. Watts called them the $1 million people because their contracts announced a different level of power before anyone touched a basketball. That memory matters because it restores the scale of the gamble. Brisker did not enter Seattle as a marginal player hoping to survive camp. He arrived with money, presence, and the expectation that a former ABA scoring star would help define the franchise. But here's where the story takes a quieter, sadder turn, because the player Seattle thought it was buying never quite showed up. In the ABA, Brisker had been a 26 points a night force, the bucket, the marquee name. In the NBA, that scorer simply faded. Across his time in the National Basketball Association, his scoring average dropped all the way down to 11.9 points per game, Not because the talent vanished, but because the situation, the system, and the man himself never lined up the way everyone hoped. Picture the gap between those two numbers. 26 in one league, under 12 in the other. That's not a small adjustment. That's a star slowly becoming a role player, a marquee name fading toward the margins. The fire that made him impossible to guard in the ABA didn't translate cleanly to his new home. The money said franchise cornerstone. The minutes and the points began to tell a different story. And as the on-court production cooled, the off-court friction started to heat up. Because waiting for John Brisker in Seattle was not just a new league and a new system. There was a coach there, a Hall of Fame name, a man who had won more than almost anyone in the history of the sport, and a personality every bit as strong as Brisker's own. In Seattle, John Brisker met an immovable force, a legendary coach who would not bend to him, would not coddle him, would not be intimidated by the reputation that had frightened so many others. And the war between those two men would help bring John Brisker's basketball career to an end. The coach was Bill Russell, and you don't need me to explain who Bill Russell was. A champion many times over, one of the towering figures the game has ever produced, and by this point, the head coach of the Seattle SuperSonics. When John Brisker arrived, two of the strongest personalities in basketball found themselves in the same building, on the same team, fighting for control. It was never going to be peaceful. And it wasn't. These weren't quiet disagreements behind closed doors. They were the kind of conflicts that showed up in the record, clashes that resulted in fines and demotions. Picture that dynamic. On one side, a Hall of Fame coach used to commanding respect and winning on his own terms. On the other, a volatile star who had spent his whole career refusing to back down to anyone, who had once walked away from college on his own terms and returned to practice waving a gun. Two men, neither built to surrender. There was only ever going to be one outcome. The clashes with Russell, including fines, reduced minutes, and demotion, contributed to Brisker's gradual exit from the league. This was not a career ended by one injury or one transaction. It was a relationship deteriorating in public, while the player became less productive and the coach gained more control. Brisker's temperament was part of that unraveling, but the record also shows a team struggling to find any useful place for a highly paid scorer it no longer trusted. One late scene shows the conflict better than any general description. Brisker had spent long stretches outside the rotation and believed Russell was damaging his name. The day before a game against Portland, he told reporters the organization had done everything possible to demean him. Then Russell used him, and Brisker answered with 28 points in a comeback victory. For one night, the old scorer was visible again, not in a minor league gym, but in a game Seattle needed. The performance did not produce reconciliation. Slick Watts later remembered the locker room afterward, where Brisker fixed Russell with a stare so intense that Watts feared the confrontation might become physical. That is the tragedy of the Seattle chapter in one room. The player had just supplied proof that he could still matter, yet the coach and player looked less capable of trusting each other than before. A successful night became another step toward the exit. But here's the detail that turns this from a simple coach versus player feud into something genuinely haunting. The resentment didn't fade when the career ended. It didn't cool with time. Years later, long after Brisker had left basketball behind, his old teammate, Spencer Haywood, would describe how Brisker remained consumed by Bill Russell. Just the mention of the name could set him off. Whatever happened between those two men in Seattle, it lodged itself deep in John Brisker and never let go. It became part of the troubled man he was becoming in his final years. So this was the war inside the Sonics, a power struggle that no contract, no matter how large, could fix. The million-dollar bet was souring. The relationship with the head coach was toxic, and the scoring had dried up. Something had to give. And while that feud was raging, the Sonics tried a desperate, almost unthinkable experiment in February of 1974. They took a player they'd paid a fortune for and sent him all the way down to the minor leagues. And there, in that strange exile, John Brisker did something almost impossible to believe. In February of 1974, the Seattle SuperSonics made a stunning decision. They took John Brisker, a man they were paying serious money, a former two-time All-Star, and assigned him down to the Cherry Hill Rookies of the Eastern Basketball Association. The Eastern Basketball Association, a minor league. For a player of his pedigree and his price tag, that was a humbling, almost shocking fall. It was the basketball equivalent of sending a luxury car to sit in a parking lot. A clear signal of just how badly things had broken down in Seattle. But John Brisker didn't sulk his way through the demotion. He did the opposite. In his Cherry Hill debut, he poured in 51 points. The next game brought 58. His minor league coach said Brisker played as though it were the final game of his life. That description matters more than simply calling him angry. Demotion had given him a smaller stage, and he attacked it with the urgency of a man trying to force the larger league to look back at him. In his third game, he was still rolling, with 29 points on the board, when a back injury finally pulled him off the floor. So in 3 games at that level, the man scored 51, 58, and 29 before his body gave out. That's not a player who'd lost his ability.
That's a player whose ability was never the problem in the first place. And it worked, at least for the moment. After that injury, Brisker returned to Seattle for treatment. And then he did something pure Brisker. He convinced the SuperSonics to recall him. He talked his way back. And on the 14th of February, 1974, the Sonics brought him back up. The minor league exile was over almost as fast as it began. But step back and look at what that whole detour really revealed. Here was a man who could still drop 50 in a heartbeat, who could dominate any court you put him on, and yet a man his own team had felt compelled to ship out. The talent could not be questioned. The fit, the temperament, the relationship with his coach, that was the broken thing. John Brisker could still play. He just couldn't quite belong. The Cherry Hill outburst proved that Brisker could still score. It could not repair the trust in Seattle. His gift remained visible, while the professional space available for it kept shrinking. Near the end of that season, another side of him briefly entered the public record. Brisker was awaiting the birth of his first child and spoke with unusual self-awareness about the reputation he had created. He acknowledged that he needed to grow up, that attitude mattered, and that he had carried a large chip, as though the world were against him. He said he wanted to turn his life around and live down the image attached to his name. Those words do not erase the incidents that came before or prove that change followed. They do show that Brisker was not blind to the cost of his behavior. He understood that the same reputation, once marketed by Pittsburgh, had become an obstacle in Seattle. He could name the problem and imagine a different future, even while his relationship with Russell was collapsing. That makes the failure more painful. This was not simply a man who never recognized the door closing. For at least one moment, he saw it and said publicly that he wanted another way through. Up to now, you've met one version of this man: the fighter, the gunfighter on the media guide, the player a coach put a bounty on. But here's where the story gets complicated, because the people who knew John Brisker away from the court described somebody almost unrecognizable from the man who terrified opponents. Somebody, in their words, as charming as a maitre d'. The most vivid portrait of that side came from Zali Volchak, who served as the Seattle SuperSonics general manager during Brisker's time with the team. Volchak had every reason to be wary of the man. He was the executive managing the contract, the demotions, the friction. And yet when Volchak talked about Brisker, he didn't reach for stories about violence. He reached for warmth. He called him a handsome guy. He said that when Brisker walked into a room, it seemed the eyes of every woman in the place turned to him. That's a particular kind of presence, the kind you can't manufacture, the kind that fills a space the moment a man steps through the door. The same intensity that made him frightening on the floor made him magnetic in a crowd. Different setting, same gravity. But it wasn't only charm. Volchak remembered something deeper, something that cuts against the entire enforcer legend. When it came to doing charity work, he said, he could always count on John. Volchak would ask Brisker to do telethons for the Variety Club or anything else, and it was never a problem. Let that sit for a moment. The man whose teammates chose their words carefully, the man who returned to practice armed, that same man said yes again and again when his team asked him to give his time to children's charity work. No hesitation, no fuss. So which one was the real John Brisker? The volatile enforcer or the generous, easy gentleman who never turned down a good cause? The honest answer is that both were real, living side by side in the same body. And that's exactly what makes his story so hard to hold on to. You can't reduce him to a villain, and you can't sand him into a hero. He was both, all at once. And the people around him spent years trying to reconcile the two. That generous, charming side is precisely what makes the next stretch of his life so difficult to explain. Because by 1976, an old teammate would look at John Brisker and see neither the fighter nor the gentleman. He'd see a man quietly slipping into something dark. By around 1975, the basketball was over. The career that had carried John Brisker out of Detroit, made him a two-time All-Star, and brought him $1 million contract, had run out of road. We do not need to guess at every emotional consequence. The practical change was enormous. No season, no locker room, no professional role, and no clear replacement for the structure that had organized his adult life. He had already tried to build something beyond basketball. In Seattle, Brisker operated a club called the New Heritage House on Empire Way, a place connected to another part of him that teammates remembered clearly: his love of music. He entertained players and hosted established acts, including the Whispers. This was not the image of a man incapable of imagining a second life. It was an attempt to create one, using hospitality and music instead of scoring. But the club closed after his final NBA season, leaving more than $40,000 in rent, taxes, and insurance reportedly unpaid. Other ventures also failed to provide stable ground. The contrast was harsh. In basketball, Brisker could enter a building and immediately understand how value was measured. Outside it,
The same confidence did not guarantee that a business survived, a debt disappeared, or the next opportunity arrived. And as the basketball faded, something else moved into the space it left behind. John Brisker developed a deepening interest in reconnecting with his African roots. Teammates remembered him borrowing books about Africa, reading, searching. They remembered him sometimes wearing dashikis. On its own, that's not strange at all. Plenty of men in that era were exploring their heritage, asking who they were beyond the game and the country they grew up in. But in Brisker's case, that interest would eventually pull him toward the journey that swallowed him whole. There's also a darker thread that runs through this period, and it has to be handled with care. His former coach, Tom Nisselke, later offered a grim assessment of Brisker's life, suggesting in an interview that Brisker was, in his words, probably one of the first players to get involved in that world, and adding that with the guns, you never knew what was going to happen out there. It's important to be precise here. That was Nisselke's stated belief, his recollection years later, not something established by any record. We pass it along as one man's impression, no more and no less, because the truth of those final years is murkier than any single quote can capture. What is supported is a picture of a man searching for direction. He was out of the league, his ventures were failing, and his attention increasingly turned toward Africa. In 1976, or possibly the following year according to Spencer Haywood's later recollection, Brisker appeared at his old friend's home in New York, carrying a set of conga drums. The visit became one of the last detailed personal accounts of him. The friend was Spencer Haywood, a former teammate, a man who'd known Brisker in better days. And when Brisker arrived in New York that year, he came bearing a gift, a set of conga drums. There's something almost tender about that image. A man known for his fists, showing up at a friend's home with hand drums, a peace offering, a piece of the African world he'd been reading about. He didn't just drop by either. He stayed for an entire week. Over the week, Haywood's warmth turned into concern. He remembered Brisker remaining consumed by the conflict with Russell years after the basketball relationship had ended. Haywood even tried to persuade him not to return overseas, believing his friend sounded troubled and needed to confront anger that could no longer be blamed entirely on an old coach. Haywood later said he believed Brisker had become involved in dark, shady places. He did not provide evidence or enough detail to turn that concern into a factual account of Brisker's activities. The value of the recollection is narrower and more human. A friend spent a week with him, became worried, and tried unsuccessfully to stop him from leaving again. The conga drums remained after Brisker left Haywood's home. They were a gift, a sign of friendship, and a small piece of the identity Brisker was exploring beyond basketball. Haywood eventually placed them in storage. Years later, the object would still exist, while the man who carried it through the door could no longer be located. That visit became one of the last clear human glimpses anyone close to him could describe in detail. Before John Brisker disappeared, one more fact changed the stakes. In early 1978, he became a father again. In February of 1978, John Brisker and his girlfriend welcomed a daughter. A newborn does not prove that a troubled life has become stable, and the script should not impose that transformation on him. What the child does establish is the human cost of the timing. Only weeks later, her father left the country. She would inherit no reliable explanation for what followed. And on the surface, the pieces of a stable life were there. He had a house in Redmond. He had money set aside in the bank. He had children. These were the trappings of a man trying to construct something real, a home, a future, a foundation under his feet after years of searching. If you only looked at that snapshot, you might think John Brisker had finally found his footing. But underneath that picture sat a far more troubled domestic history, and it has to be told carefully and honestly. The year before, in 1977, his wife Michelle had filed for divorce, and in the court filings tied to that case, she made serious allegations.
In those documents, she alleged that Brisker had abused her, and according to a later account in the Pittsburgh press, she said the harm had left her deaf in one ear. In her words, recorded in those court filings, he bounced her around the wall and threw her on the bed. These were allegations made by Michelle in court filings during a divorce. They entered the public record through her account and were later reported by the press. They were not established as proven facts in a separate judgment. Even with that distinction, the filings complicate any simple picture of Brisker settling peacefully into a new home and fatherhood. So this was John Brisker at the start of 1978, a new father and homeowner with money in the bank, but also a man whose marriage had ended amid grave allegations and whose business life had produced instability. 1 month after the baby arrived, he left the United States for what court records later described as an overseas business venture. In March of 1978, John Brisker left the country. King County court documents described his purpose as an attempt to launch an import-export venture in Africa. That establishes the declared destination and reason, not proof of where every stage of the journey took him. The distinction becomes crucial because later government inquiries could not verify his arrival on the continent. The timing remains difficult to understand without pretending to know his private reasoning. He had a newborn daughter, a house, and money in the bank. He also had failed ventures, a fractured family life, and a sustained interest in Africa. The available record tells us what stood on either side of the decision. It does not tell us which motive finally carried the most weight. For a few weeks, there was still contact. On the 11th of April, 1978, John Brisker called his girlfriend in Seattle. The location of the call has never been established with confidence. What matters is that the conversation remains the last verified contact anyone close to him received. No further calls, no letters, and no confirmed sightings followed. The connection went quiet and stayed quiet. Seattle still contained the fixed parts of his life: a baby, another daughter, a house in Redmond, money in an account, and property that would eventually require legal decisions. Calling those things abandoned would imply an intention the evidence cannot establish. They were left without him, and the people attached to them had no way to know whether he had chosen silence or been prevented from breaking it. Because when his family and friends realized the silence wasn't lifting, they turned to the people whose job it is to find missing Americans abroad. And what those investigators came back with would only deepen the mystery, because the United States government couldn't even confirm that John Brisker had set foot on the continent at all. When the months stacked up and no word came, John Brisker's family did the only thing left to do. They went to the people whose entire job is finding missing Americans overseas, the FBI and the State Department. If anyone could pick up the trail, surely it would be them. They had the reach, the contacts, the channels into foreign governments. So the family waited for an answer, hoping for anything: a sighting, a record, a name on a passenger list. What came back wasn't an answer. It was a void. After looking into it, those investigators told Brisker's family they could not find evidence that he had even entered Africa. Read that again, because it's the strange beating heart of this whole story. Not that they couldn't find his body, not that they couldn't trace his final movements. They couldn't confirm he had arrived on the continent at all. The trail didn't go cold in some African city. It appeared to vanish before it ever truly began. The State Department's later position captured the bureaucratic problem. It did not accept that Brisker's status had been conclusively resolved. That was not evidence that he remained alive, only a refusal to treat absence as proof of a specific outcome. For his family, the distinction offered no useful closure. It left them between two possibilities, without enough evidence to live comfortably inside either one. Put the two records side by side, and the limit becomes clear. The court documents preserve Brisker's stated purpose, an African import-export venture. The government inquiry speaks to verification. Investigators could not establish that he arrived. Those records do not literally contradict each other. One records an intention. The other exposes the absence of a reliable trail showing that the intention was completed. That's the trap at the center of the John Brisker mystery. There is no clean version. Every thread you pull leads to another thread that contradicts it. And into that vacuum of official silence, where the government would only say it didn't consider him gone, the rumors came pouring in. The most explosive of them all would place John Brisker in the middle of one of the most violent regimes the African continent had ever seen. When the official channels came up empty, the people who'd known Brisker started filling the silence with theories of their own. And these have to be handled with real care, because what follows is speculation. The guesses of former teammates trying to make sense of a friend who simply evaporated. None of it is established fact. It's what they imagined might have happened, and it's important to keep that line bright and clear. Spencer Haywood, the same old friend who'd watched Brisker grow troubled during that week in New York, offered one version. He said he always wondered what happened, and then people put out the rumors that Brisker had been caught up in that coup in Uganda. Those are his words, and a rumor he passed along, not a fact he confirmed. Notice his own words. People put out the rumors. Even Haywood framed it as something that circulated, not something he knew. Another former teammate, Tom Burleson, went a step further, saying flatly that Brisker went to Uganda and that it was as a mercenary, that he was fighting over there. A professional basketball player, the theory went, picking up a weapon in a foreign conflict. There's a darker version still, a circulating claim that Brisker was shot during an argument with people connected to the Ugandan government. But there is no documentary support for that anywhere in the reliable record. No report, no confirmation, no evidence. It belongs in this story only as one of the rumors that grew in the dark, and it deserves to be named as exactly that and nothing more. In 1980, an Associated Press story repeated a report that John Brisker was missing and had been shot in Africa. That sounds like confirmation until the rest of the same account is considered. Brisker's brother Ralph offered a different location and purpose, saying John had visited Africa earlier and purchased land in Nigeria rather than Uganda. Ralph also said he had not seen his brother since 1976. The article preserved the claim, but it also preserved the contradictions that prevented the claim from becoming proof. So lay it all out together. Teammates say Uganda, a coup, a mercenary's fight. Court documents say Africa for business. His own flesh and blood says Nigeria, land, and no contact for years. The State Department says they can't even confirm he arrived. 4 sources, 4 versions, and not one of them locks cleanly into the others. The man had become a story everyone could tell, and no one could prove. And just when the Uganda theory seemed to dominate the conversation, an even stranger one emerged, a theory that pulled John Brisker thousands of miles off the African continent entirely, toward a jungle where on a single day, more than 900 people would die. This next theory is one of the most bizarre turns in an already bizarre story, and almost nobody who studies the case puts any real stock in it. But it's circulated, and to understand just how wild the rumor mill around John Brisker became, you have to hear it. The theory goes like this. Brisker had a great aunt who had reportedly relocated to a remote settlement in Guyana, run by the cult leader Jim Jones. According to the story, that relative had tried to recruit Brisker more than once, urging him to come join the community in the jungle. And by every account, Brisker declined. He wanted nothing to do with it. But the theory suggests that somehow he ended up there anyway, at the very place that would soon become a synonym for horror. In November of 1978, that settlement in Guyana became the site of one of the worst mass tragedies of the era, with more than 900 people losing their lives on a single day. The aunt, the story says, was among the gone found in the aftermath. But here's the crucial part. No trace of John Brisker was ever found there. Not a record, not a body, not a shred of evidence placing him in that jungle. So while the theory exists, it is one that almost no one believes, and it survives only as a measure of how desperate people were for any explanation at all. Why did one disappearance breed theories involving Uganda, Nigeria, a coup, mercenary work, and a settlement on another continent? The conditions invited invention. There was no confirmed final location. Relatives repeated different accounts, and government inquiries could not verify the journey described in the legal record. Brisker's frightening reputation made violent explanations feel emotionally plausible, even when the documents did not support them. The legend supplied a ready-made ending, and the absence of evidence left no fact strong enough to stop it. The vacuum allowed every rumor to rush in. While people argued over countries, political figures, and imagined final confrontations, a courtroom back in King County faced a colder question. Property, custody, and an estate could not remain suspended forever. The law had to make an administrative decision, even though the mystery had produced no reliable ending. The law doesn't have the luxury of leaving things open forever. Property has to be settled. Bank accounts have to go somewhere. Children have to be provided for. And so, with no body, no confirmed sighting, and a tangle of contradicting stories, the matter of John Brisker landed in a King County courtroom that had to make a ruling the world couldn't. On May 29, 1985, the King County medical examiner declared John Brisker deceased in absentia. The purpose was practical. His estate could not remain suspended forever. More than 7 years had passed since the final telephone call, and no investigation had produced a verified location or an explanation. The declaration did not result from the discovery of remains. It resulted from prolonged silence and the legal need to settle what Brisker had left behind. Those belongings made the disappearance painfully ordinary. There was a house in Redmond, roughly $29,000 in a bank account, and property that still required an owner on paper. There were also 2 young daughters whose lives could not be placed on hold while adults argued over an estate. Years of legal conflict followed as the court tried to divide the fixed pieces of a life whose central fact
remained unresolved. The ruling answered financial and administrative questions. It did not answer the human one. May 29th was the date of the declaration, not proof that anything happened to Brisker on that day. The court could address the house, the account, and custody. It could not determine whether he had reached Uganda, Nigeria, or somewhere else, much less establish what happened afterward. That gap is why one small object carries so much weight in the story. In 1976, during a troubled visit to New York, Brisker arrived at Spencer Haywood's door, carrying conga drums as a gift. Haywood later placed them in storage. The drums remained while their owner disappeared, a physical reminder of the generous man his friends sometimes saw beneath the reputation for confrontation. They do not solve anything. They simply prove how much of an ordinary life continued to exist around the legend. The legend itself can overwhelm the player. Brisker averaged better than 20 points across his professional career and more than 26 during his ABA prime. He became a two-time All-Star and once answered demotion by scoring 51 and 58 points on consecutive nights. Defenders did not fear him only because of stories about fights. They feared a powerful scorer who could take over games and punish almost any matchup. Yet the contradictions were real. Former teammates remembered intimidation, volatility, and an incident in which he reportedly returned to practice carrying a weapon. Team officials also remembered a handsome, engaging man who repeatedly gave his time when the organization asked him to help children or appear at community events. Turning one side into the secret, real Brisker would make the story easier, but the evidence does not permit it. Both reputations followed the same person. The final verified facts are much narrower than the mythology. Brisker left the United States in March of 1978. In April, he called his girlfriend in Seattle. After that, confirmed contact ended. His family sought help. Government inquiries failed to establish a reliable trail, and even relatives offered conflicting accounts of the country and purpose behind his trip. Everything beyond those points remains theory. Former teammates spoke about mercenary work or an encounter with people connected to the Ugandan government. His brother described Nigeria and a possible land purchase. A later rumor placed him near the People's Temple community in Guyana, although the record offers little reason to accept it. None of those versions has been proved, and repeating one more loudly does not turn it into an answer. That is why John Brisker is remembered first as the player who vanished, and only second as the player he had been. The mystery swallowed the scoring, the all-star selections, and the complicated man teammates knew. His final public trace was not a box score or transaction. It was a telephone call from an uncertain location, and the silence that followed. For the daughter born 2 months before that call, the mystery was never merely an irresistible sports story. The public inherited theories. His children inherited absence. They could find the points, contracts, fights, and all-star selections in print. They could find former teammates arguing over countries and motives. What they could not find was a verified account of where their father went, whether he intended to return, or why no message ever followed. The law could assign the house and the bank account. It could not assign an explanation. That is the part a dramatic theory can easily obscure. Solving the story with an unsupported mercenary tale may satisfy an audience for a moment, but it replaces a family's uncertainty with a narrator's invention. The honest version is less tidy and more painful. Brisker left behind enough evidence to prove that he had lived loudly, yet not enough to explain how his life disappeared from view. The legal record eventually closed the estate. It never closed the disappearance. The conga drums remained in storage. The basketball numbers remained in the books. And every dramatic theory remained unsupported by proof. John Brisker had been one of the most feared scorers of his era, a man whose life generated more than enough noise to become legend.
Then came a final telephone call, and silence.
The points are recorded. The fights are remembered. His daughters grew up where answers should have been. After April 11th, 1978, the most honest ending is also the hardest one. The record stops before the truth begins.